Richard Glover with you on Drive. Thank you for spending some time with us this afternoon. At the Monday Political Forum, Linda Burney is the ALP's Sydney member for Barton and Shadow Minister for Families and Social Services and for Indigenous Australians. She joins us. Linda, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Richard.
Thank
hello,
you.
Wendy, and hello, Joe.
Yeah, with us too is Wendy Machin, Vice Chair of the New South Wales National Party, and also Dr Joe McGurr, who's the independent member for Wagga Wagga, and kind of importantly today used to be an emergency doctor, still assists in surgeries, a medical administrator by trade now, but he's someone who actually knows a little bit of about doctoring, which might be pretty useful. Joe, hello.
Hello,
you got Joe.
Oh,
okay. Oh, sorry, we're a bit confused about what lines people are taking. Joe, welcome. Thank you for joining us here on Drive. The PM, among others, has rounded on those who crowded onto Bondi Beach, forcing its closure, while others have criticised the selfish behaviour of those who, over the weekend, went into bars or attended gyms before both things were banned at noon today. Are Australians taking this serious enough, changing their behaviour in a way that might help us all survive the worst of this pandemic? Joe McGurr, let's start with you.
Yeah, well, Richard, I think it was a bit disappointing, those behaviours on the weekend. I think, to be fair, though, it has been a bit unreal for people. It has been something that's been overseas, and it's not a kind of tangible thing for many people. And they're a bit blasé about it. And I also think, before we go roundly criticising everyone, I do think that for some people it was a way of avoiding the reality, as a way of coping almost. In other words, look, it's not going to be a problem. It's not going to affect me. Most people survive without a problem. Look, really, they can't be that serious. But,
okay, so the equivalent of putting your fingers in your ears and going la 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 la.
A little bit like that. Kind of, it's a natural reaction for some people. It's a way some people do cope with what can be really scary circumstances. So I guess I'm being a bit generous in giving people an understanding of that. But it wasn't good, and I'm glad that it's been put to rights and that the new measures have been introduced.
Have we woken up to ourselves now?
Well, certainly down in Wagga Wagga, the message is getting through loud and clear. I'm not sure what it's like in other parts, but my sense from looking at media is, yes, we now think we're at war. We now think we're in uncharted territory. It's people are waking up. Yep. Could
the government have brought us to this state of realisation a little earlier by making the advice a bit clearer? It has been a little bit complex. Before, they've now said, okay, the bars and restaurants, they're closed, Should they have done this a bit before rather than this sort of 1.5 metre sort of thing?
I think it's pretty easy to criticise. I think we've got a situation here where we're actually learning as we go. In fact, across the planet, we're learning as we go. And so there aren't easy answers. It's not as straightforward as a flood or a bushfire that we've been in before. This is new stuff. So I think we've got to accept that. And I think also, as people are now realising, the impact on the economy of these drastic measures is really significant. So I think it's been understandable that there's been, the government, if you like, hasn't rushed in on this stuff. I think that's understandable. However, the point you've just made, which I think is really important, is that we need clear messaging, clear, calm communication, and actually it's got to be unified across the governments. Otherwise, people will start to lose trust. And if we lose that, then I think things will get really bad.
If there's anybody still listening who doesn't get it, can you as a medical person explain what has happened in Italy and what could happen here if the cases go up in a way that overwhelms the health system?
Okay, so that's interesting actually, because I actually listened to a webinar on the weekend with some Italian surgeons describing what had happened there, and it has been quite extraordinary. And to give you an example, they're talking about a situation where quite sophisticated hospitals, quite large hospitals, with, say, an intensive care unit of 8 to 12 beds, has had to quadruple that to 48 beds, and they're now thinking of opening up more intensive care beds on the tennis court to accommodate the demand. So just imagine that sort of tripling of intensive care beds to cope with demand, and you get some idea of when this gets out of control, the impact it's going to have on our hospital system.
And if there's still any young people thinking it doesn't matter to me, and A, they're wrong about this because the virus can do great damage to younger people, but also what if in that situation, what if you have a motorcycle accident and you get taken to a hospital in which every single bed has got a queue for it?
Well, in fact, what they've started to do in Italy is they've started to increase capacity in the system, so they've started to increase the number of beds they've got to cope with that. And they've actually started dividing hospitals between COVID hospitals or COVID parts of the hospital and non-COVID, so that you actually try and separate out the two cohorts. Now, we're clearly not at that stage yet, but I think the planning in the health system is probably beginning to look at those scenarios. It's very important that the system copes with the impact of, ordinary business, if you like, motor vehicle accidents, heart attacks and all that, but we also have to take account of what could happen with COVID. And it could mean you end up with separate facilities looking after one and the other.
Okay, but the basic advice is if you don't want to do this for yourself, you should do it for yourself, but if you don't want to do it for yourself, for God's sake, do it for those poor overworked doctors and nurses. Give them a chance.
Exactly right, and give them a chance not to catch the virus as well, so because we need them. But yeah, absolutely. If you don't want to do it for yourself, for goodness sake, the system it needs everyone to cooperate for us to get through this. We will get through this. But everyone needs to play a part and take some responsibility. I guess that was the messaging around Bondi on the weekend for me.
Yeah, Dr. Joe McGurr, independent for Wagga Wagga, is here. So is Linda Burney. Linda, are Australians, we did so well in a way in the bushfires. Have we shown a less attractive side of ourselves this time around?
Richard, I think most people are taking this very, very seriously. I was talking to a friend of mine who lives in Bondi that was just absolutely mortified when he took his dog for a walk the other night along the Strand and saw what was going on. I also have to a degree agree with Joe. A lot of young people, well before this virus, thought the world was ending. So we need to take into perspective a little bit of that. But those people that gathered in bars, that went to gyms, that did the beach thing, really should be hanging their head in shame, because their selfish behaviour has translated into some very, very draconian announcements that were made, but necessary announcements yesterday. And can I finish up by saying that people have to realise that the world has changed forever, and our behaviour, even though there is going to be, as Scott Morrison endlessly says, we're going to come out on the other side, that our behaviours and the way in which we operate as a society are going to be very different. And one of the things that I did want to point out very clearly is that I represent the Labor side of politics, and we are taking a very bipartisan approach to the measures that the government wants to bring in. But I do think, Richard, to the heart of your question, that people are very much getting it, and I am seeing this, my staff are seeing this very much with the traffic that's coming through our electoral offices.
Okay, I mean, you could say it's not people's fault. If the government doesn't ban bars and doesn't ban gyms and says they're all open, with some rules, doesn't ban beaches, says they're all open with some rules, that people are saying, oh, well, you said it was okay.
Yes, and you make a fair point there, and I don't think hectoring people into stopping it is the way to go about it. I think it's the point that has been made consistently. There needs to be a good source of advice, and you've got to give people real reasons and real rules to work by. But we also have to change our behaviour, all of us, and be a little bit more collective in our thinking.
Yeah, Linda Burney is with us, so is Dr. Joe McGurr, and so is Wendy Machin, who's a Vice Chair of the New South Wales National Party. Wendy, do we finally get it now, and were we in danger of not getting it last week?
Richard, I think we are getting it slowly. And it's a weird thing, I don't know why Australians seem to think they're a little bit different. Maybe it's a bit of our colonial background coming out for those of us who've been here a long time. We just don't like rules. We don't like obeying rules, bit of the larrikin thing. But, and perhaps it's just we're a long way away. It's taken a while to accelerate here, but you can see it exponentially increasing day after day as the virus spreads. So I think it perhaps just took us a while to realise that, hey, we are part of the world and we're in this as well, and we've got to be responsibly in this.
But it wasn't that. See, I just thought it wasn't that hard. It wasn't that hard to look at Italy and to understand that we're no different from Italy. We've both got quite sophisticated health systems, etc., quite similar countries. Why wouldn't it happen here just as badly as there if we don't do something?
Well, I don't think it's that hard either, but, some people clearly do. Whether they just think it won't happen to me. It is a little bit selfish. I was just reading Amanda Vanstone's column, and I do like her turn of phrase, and she talked about, the idiots on Bondi Beach, and it's kind of funny that a simple thing like that, which is normally something we would celebrate, isn't that great? Everybody having a fabulous time down on Bondi Beach, it's a hot day. It became a symbol for something entirely unacceptable to the community. So how we police beaches will be an interesting thing. I hope it doesn't come to policemen walking along beaches and telling people they have to separate.
It has already. Yeah, there's a picture of a police officer on Bondi Beach in the Telly or the Herald today. I can't remember. Can I ask you about the schools, Wendy? Because this has been the real sort of crunch point in Victoria. With school holidays approaching, schools will be closed from tomorrow, but in New South Wales there's a different policy which was announced this morning by the Premier. Schools will remain open, but with a request that parents should keep their children at home if at all possible. Is that New South Wales advice a reasonable compromise given the arguments on both sides when it comes to closing or not closing the school system?
Richard, I can't tell if that was for me.
Yeah, for you, Wendy. Yeah.
I don't know if your audience doesn't know we're having a few technical problems getting us to phone in, but I'm also hearing, and they mightn't like this, but I'm hearing all of your crews chat. I can hear everything they're saying.
They're just saying how marvellous you are, Wendy.
Well, they were just discussing the fact that I said I had a glass of rosé for lunch when they were doing a sound check. And I guess that's one of the downsides of this. I'm a bit bored being stuck at home like everybody else.
So just tell me about the schools. Do you think the compromise in New South Wales is bang on?
I think it's another one of these we have to suck it and see exercises. From what I'm reading and hearing, young people aren't as affected by this virus as much as those at the other end of the age spectrum, but they can carry it. So it's a real challenge to try and maintain, the potential contagion risk. So if it is in young people, large groups congregating, they risk infecting teachers. So I think it's a case of we'll have to see how it goes. Maybe it makes sense to do what Victoria's done and pull the holidays forward, put everybody on holidays a bit longer. Perhaps they can catch it up at the end of the year. Pretty tough on those kids doing the HSC and in their senior years, but for younger students, maybe that's an option. But there's a lot of learning by doing at the moment, isn't there?
Yeah, that's right. It's so uncharted. Joe McGurr, has the Berejiklian government got this one right in terms of schools? Basically, yes, keep them open for people who really need them, but if you can possibly keep your children at home, do so?
Look, I think this is a really difficult one. And look, you've only got to look at the advice at national level and the debate that's going along amongst the doctors, experts on this to know that this isn't clear. There's some evidence actually, and I heard from the Chief Health Officer today for New South Wales say there's actually some evidence that kids are not only resilient to it, but actually aren't the spreaders that we used to think they were, and they may actually get it from adults, so there's another complication to the issue. Look, I think what New South Wales has done is essentially it's instituted a transition process. It'll give people time to get their home arrangements set up. It'll give time for the online forums to start working, and I think it will position it to do a shutdown in the future, perhaps after the school holiday. So I think actually, as Wendy said, I think it's a suck it and see approach, and I don't think it's too bad. Okay,
and in the end they'll probably be closed. Linda Burney, do you think that's right?
No, I don't. I think the advice is incredibly confusing. It's kind of half of one and six of the other. I think the New South Wales government has tried to clarify, but it's still left parents confused. It just seems to me that there are models around the world, one of which Chris Bowen spoke about from Norway, where there was some measure of schools left open for health workers. And I do think that there is an element of the tight funding arrangements here between the Commonwealth and the state, which they will sort out. But the New South Wales government needs to be clear one way or the other with its advice.
Okay, well, you're implying that the Morrison government has heavied the New South Wales government, that the New South Wales government really wanted to close them down, but the Morrison government brought up funding. Is that your suggestion?
What I'm saying is that there is complex funding agreements between state and territory governments. The operation of schools is absolutely a state responsibility. I don't know what's happened behind the scenes, but it seems to me that the New South Wales decision has still left parents in a dilemma.
Yeah, well, in the end, though, might it end... I know that Norwegian model, and there's a British model, which is skeleton schools, whereby they close down some schools but keep some open for the health workers. Isn't, in a way, the New South Wales version... The New South Wales statement a version of that, whereby they're clearly hoping that 80% of kids are going to stay away, that they will be skeleton schools in a sense?
Well, in a sense, I guess you could say that, but my understanding, and I've got a number of friends that are teachers, Richard, is about 30 to 40% of children are not attending school. You've got school holidays starting very, very soon. So I think there needs to be a clear decision by New South Wales so people know what they're doing during and after the school holidays. Okay,
make clear the expectations of parents. There's Linda Burney. Dr. Joe McGurr is here, so is Wendy Machin, the Monday Political Forum. Can we talk about impacts on the economy, on people's sense of isolation, on social equity, on areas we might not have even thought about yet? When we look back at this, what will be the ways in which this virus really has changed things, maybe in surprising ways, and what are the perils we should really be on the lookout for? Linda Burney.
Thank you, Richard. I wrote to my counterpart in the government today expressing some concerns and gaps in what was announced by the Prime Minister yesterday in relation to social welfare. But I do think there are some things that we still haven't thought about. One of the things that's very much struck me, and I was listening to Megan Mitchell this morning, were, there is a big focus, understandably, on physical harm, but what about the mental anguish that so many people are going to go through, and we know the terrible spate of youth suicides here in Australia. I don't think we've explored very much what it means to be cooped up at home with financial worries and what that might transform into in terms of bullying and domestic violence. But and I know you've got to get through a lot here, but it seems to me that the loss of our income, the uncertainty, the enormous changes in people's lives are things that we'll be looking back on, not to mention the long tail that the economic impact will have.
Linda, thank you. Wendy Machin, what are some of the things we really should be on the lookout for? Maybe even some of the less discussed impacts of this?
I think it's really going to change the way we work, and I think there'll be good and bad aspects to that. It may well be that companies and organisations find that some roles are not needed, or they're not needed in the way that they were needed prior to the outbreak of the virus. So structures within companies might change, and that'll be difficult for people who find that the job that they thought they might go back to, or the industry they might get a new job in, is now not there. So that kind of concerns me. But on the other hand, there are opportunities, I think, for working differently. One of the things that those who live in big cities have probably noticed is we now don't have the congestion that we get when we're all working normally, that we can, in fact, work different hours, be flexible with our hours. That has an impact on families, a positive impact on families in many ways, has a good impact on the environment, and it probably has an overall good impact on the city. So I think that's one of the big impacts we'll see, is the way we work will change, I think, quite dramatically after this.
We might learn it's a bit more of this stuff is possible. Joe McGurr, what might surprise us when we look back on this in a year's time?
Well, I think one of the factors that's emerging is this sense of a global community and just how connected we are, and how connected just the whole planet is. This is actually a response that's forcing nations to think and coordinate and realise the fragility of their own economies in the global sense. So that's one aspect of it that I think will change the way we think.
Okay, but do you see that as bringing forward a retreat from globalisation or an embrace of it?
Well, that's the $64 question, isn't it? I think that I would hope that people will understand how connected we are and how we actually do have to support each other across the planet as a planet if we're going to survive, and that retreating into our own little shells isn't going to be good for the future. But you're right, in times like this, at a time when there's uncertainty, as Linda has said, there's always a peril of simple answers, populists, demagogues getting up and wanting us to retreat. And I think that's a real peril. And look, where I think the uncharted territory for Australia is months and months of isolation. And what we have to be very careful about is the need for information to be clear, calm, and consistent. And we need to anticipate issues that are going to arise. And I'm dealing with this here locally because I'm thinking to myself, okay, well, let's say the council services lose staff for one reason or another, isolation, not necessarily sick, and the garbage days of collection gets changed, or, there's a missed collection 1 week. Well, that's got to be communicated ahead of the plans, so that everyone's aware that's going to happen, so that when the garbage isn't collected 1 week, we don't suddenly panic and go out and toss garbage into everyone's paths. Now, that's a simple example, but if we're not on the front foot, we don't have our government services thinking ahead so that the messages are clear, and people are on their own, they're on social media, I think the potential for people to dream up scenarios from misinformation will really test our social cohesion. So I think there's a big, and as Linda has highlighted, the mental health aspects of this will add to that. Our responsibility, I think, as leaders, the media's responsibility is to make sure that our messages are clear, they are calm, and we think ahead to people's needs.
Yeah, and Joe mentions mental health, and we will be talking to the former Australian of the Year, Pat McGorry. He's an expert on adolescent mental health in particular, and we'll be talking to him about that, young people, school, and all that straight after the news at 6, his advice for you. But thank you to our panellists on the Monday Political Forum, to Linda Burney, ALP member for Barton and Shadow Minister for Families and Social Services and for Indigenous Australians, to Wendy Machin, Vice Chair of the New South Wales National Party, and to Dr. Joe McGurr,